Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart is out on PC after a 2-year exclusivity on PlayStation 5. It is the first game with DirectStorage GPU decompression for loading, and one of the games that exercises the PlayStation 5 SSD hardware extensively. So it is the perfect game for a digital foundry analysis. In today's video, I will review the quality of the PC port at launch, first deriving PS5 settings and optimized settings for mid-range PCs, and going over all those graphical advantages found on the PC version when maxed out. Then I will answer the question of whether or not this game needs an SSD on PC, and what kind of hardware one should have to get a good experience here, based upon behind-the-scenes information that I have directly from Nixies on how they ported the game to PC. But before I get into that, let us start with the menus and user experience. Ratchet & Clank is similar to the Spider-Man games ported by Nixies so far to the PC. There is a real-time tweaking menu with a good array of options for users to take advantage of. In general, it is all as it previously was, and this type of options menu is superior to any other type really and works rather well. I do have some minor quibbles here though. For one, some options do not gracefully change in real time as there's a flashing that occurs and a bit of a wait time. That does make real-time tweaking of back and forths a bit of a challenge at times as you can't really remember what it looked like before due to the flashing. My biggest issue tends to be with the performance of the menu on mid-range hardware, which is concerning and a bit confusing. The main menu is heavy here, as you can see here being noticeably sub 60 FPS on this mid-range PC on the modest medium settings without ray tracing. Yes, the game is running in the background here, but if you look at the CPU and GPU utilization, we can see both components are untroubled and intensely underutilized, so I'm not sure why the menu is running the way it is. If it were CPU limited, I would have expected a different utilization spread, and perhaps lower clocks to show up, as my Ryzen 5 3600 here is actually clocking really high. This is a sign to me that this port at launch needed more polishing time. I felt that keenly in other areas as well, like the 2 crashes I had in my first few hours of play on high-end hardware. And these experiences of crashing were mirrored by my colleagues John Linneman and my colleague Richard Ledbetter, who was trying it out on a low-end machine where he was seeing out-of-memory crashes. On top of this, there are a number of inexplicable graphical regressions on PC, which you might have seen in our initial preview video, including missing transparency effects on PC, which are there on PlayStation 5. You also have transparency effects and flares having the wrong opacity, so they're either too bright or not bright enough. Then at launch, you had texture filtering occasionally not working, which has now been fixed as of the patch on Friday the 28th. Also have the issue of a number of textures on PC never loading to a higher quality when they really should, especially on ultra high-end PCs. And there can also be texture fade in simple A to B camera switches in the same scene. These issues, when combined with gameplay bugs I encountered, as well as the fact that the game is launching without supporting ray tracing on AMD hardware, well, these issues collectively give the impression of a game where the publisher Sony should have really given Nixies more time to iron out issues before a release date. The game is already 2 years late on PC, and I think 1 or 2 months of waiting would have been a non-issue. As it is right now, I think Ratchet and Clank on PC at launch isn't putting its best foot forward always when it really should. Getting into the areas where the PC version goes beyond the PlayStation 5 version in terms of visual quality, we have some of those typical advantages that you see in other games. Image quality, for example. You can run at higher resolutions than the PlayStation 5, as well as use alternative anti-aliasing techniques like DLSS, which when compared to the temporal injection solution used on PS5, will produce less ghosting and aliasing in motion, as well as being a lot less over-sharpened as you can control sharpening. DLSS also aids the quality of ray trace reflections, specifically when the camera is moving like we see here. With DLSS on the PC version, we can see a lot less aliasing in motion as well as ghosting. Not every reconstruction technique is made equal here in Ratchet & Clank on PC, and in my experience, for basic movement and image stability while moving, DLSS does reign supreme in nearly all scenarios except for one, which is when using the high ray tracing setting, which is checkerboarded. DLSS does not reconstruct that checkerboard reflection up correctly, I would say. Instead, it leaves a stable but obvious pre-checkerboarded resolution there. So if you're using RT reflection set to high, like I might recommend, perhaps consider using IGTI or or XeSS. FSR2, in my opinion, in this game leaves quite a bit to be desired in movement, so I would say best avoid it when you have other alternatives available here. Beyond common image quality differences, we also see the ability to up the quality of ray traced reflections, taking them from the checkerboarded reflections we see on console up to a full native resolution with the very high setting. This in general makes them look more detailed and have less edges and aliasing, and looks pretty darn good. Curiously, when using DLAA or DLSS like I mentioned earlier, the reflections resolve differently, almost looking a bit wider with less per pixel detail, in some way almost like they're working from a lower base resolution. Keeping with the ray tracing theme here, there are some nominally awesome upgrades over the PlayStation 5 version, as you have access to ray trace shadows, which were introduced in Miles Morales, which will dramatically increase the distance at which shadows are drawn, really dwarfing the shadow draw distance as seen without RT on PC and PlayStation 5. Shadows up close also render with less visible issues and will exhibit nice penumbra effects, so you'll have a different level of softness of the shadow depending upon the distance it is being cast from. Like Miles Morales though, the game is shipping with RT shadow issues. One issue is that they can change the visual output of some shading, and I think in an unintentional way, like with this flesh plant here. RT shadows makes it very dark in a way that looks like a visual bug. But most of the issues with RT shadows stem from the relatively low quality BVH these games from Insomniac have. So many objects, rather opaque or transparent, just do not align with the object in the primary view. Like, look at the reflection of the canister on the ground here. Notice how it's not nearly as rounded as the real object in the primary view. Since these games from Insomniac have this type of BVH, it'll cause issues with shadows. Some issues that this can cause is that, as we saw at launch before it was patched, transparencies did not look right in shadows or in reflections. This has since now been fixed as of the patch on Friday the 28th, but it was not a great thing to see at launch and gave the game an unpolished feel. Even with the patch from the 28th, there are still issues with the shadows here. Essentially, any transparency that is moving does not necessarily have its movement reflected in the shadows. In my opinion, to make RT shadows really be worth it to be used here, the game needs a much higher quality BVH, perhaps as an option for users to click. Completely new to the engine on PC is the inclusion of ray-traced ambient occlusion, which definitely does help better ground objects in the game world without distracting screen space errors. Like, look inside this log, which is kind of glowing with SSAO and all the other techniques, yet it looks suitably darkened with RTAO on. There are dials as well to adjust its performance, going from medium to very high with very little different beyond a bit of added noise and movement. And as seen next to SSAO as found on PlayStation 5, RTAO indeed is a winner for visual looks. It gets rid of obvious light leak in areas where there shouldn't be any light leaking in. Kind of like RT shadows though, there might be a couple issues in the game. Like, look at those thick plants again. The shading with ray-traced ambient occlusion sure looks different, and I'm not sure if it's exactly right. The RT upgrades in Ratchet and Clank could be great, but due to some bugs in the low quality BVH, it ends up being a bit of a mixed bag, and for most players, I would really just recommend using RT reflections, and those ultra high-end GPUs could examine using RTAO as well. Beyond ray tracing, the biggest upgrade on PC over PlayStation 5 is the new Ultra LOD distance option. This has a seriously impressive upgrade, where objects are drawn much further into the distance on PC when set to Ultra than on PlayStation 5 in its performance mode, for example. Here, the PlayStation 5 in its performance RT mode straddles between medium and high LOD distance. It has lower draw than high for some objects like these plants here, which are missing on PlayStation 5, just as they are missing on medium, but it does not degrade geometry as much as medium, like we can see here with this paneling, which looks like the high option. So the PlayStation 5 for this setting is using an in-between level, between medium and high. This brings me to my optimized settings and PlayStation 5 settings, first starting with those PlayStation 5 Performance Mode RT settings. Now, if you've watched my video on Spider-Man Miles Morales on PC, you know I've generated a rather detailed list of the settings for this engine on PC for the fidelity and performance RT modes on PlayStation 5 for that game. For the most part, nearly all of these settings that I'm showing right here are almost the exact same in my checking in Ratchet and Clank. but a couple now are different due to this game just being different here. That LOD distance that I just covered, for example, that was an obvious high in the Spider-Man games, but here it's between medium and high, so a tiny bit lower. Some other changes versus the settings I derived for the Spider-Man games are those for hair, where in performance mode RT on PS5, it's no longer as obvious as it was before. On PC, we can see that it's not the same as very high, which has a higher tessellation value for the strands of hair, so we can see the hair here on the character's forehead being much more rounded on very high than it is on the PlayStation 5's performance RT mode, as well as low to high on PC, but I cannot easily find visible differences between medium and high on PC, such as in the size or amount of hair strands like we see in Ratchet's eyebrows here. So PS5 could either be medium or high, as there's no good visible difference I can find between the two that is easily discerned. Another value that is important to being different is the RT-BVH, or object draw distance in ray tracing settings. It was lower in the Spider-Man games, and here it is now set to a value closest to 9 in Ratchet and Clank in the performance RT mode, which you can see by looking at the hanging plants here, as well as the detail on the building in the background. It's closest to 9, yet there are some differences with PC. The detail of vegetation at a distance is lower than found on any PC setting, as we can see with this bush right here, and you can see this with other aspects in the game as well. So the RT object distance setting does not align perfectly well with the PC values. Another thing confounding this is just the general bugs in the PC's ray tracing BVH that I talked about earlier in regards to the quality of objects close to the camera. And also there are some other bugs in the game's ray tracing that I haven't touched on yet, such as how object draw being set lower can sometimes look better than it being set higher. Like here, where the object draw range is set to 8 and has nice shadows drawing from the crowds that are not there when the value is set to 9 or 10, which should be higher, and of course you would think it would look better, but it just doesn't at the moment. Another discrepancy is that the RT performance mode appears to be lacking the distance depth of field at times on in gameplay that is seen in the fidelity mode, as well as a number of the graphical settings on PC, which would put it close to the very low depth of field setting on PC. But in cinematics, the quality and shape of the depth of field blur is more around medium and high, and definitely not low or very low. So there are some custom unattainable values being used for the graphical settings on PlayStation 5 to keep it at 60 that are not available on PC. A last interesting point is that the traffic density option now controls the amount of bystanders in the game as well, in addition to the cars flying by, which was originally controlled by two separate options in the Spider-Man games. Here, the option, as used on PlayStation 5's Performance RT mode, is closest to the high setting on PC. With these discrepancies in mind and a few others, here are my updated settings for the Performance RT mode as approximated on PC with the settings available there. Some settings like particle density and hair quality no longer show obvious visual differences between medium and high on PC, so it's not exactly possible to know the exact value that PlayStation 5 could be using, but I would skew towards high here. And now let's move on to my optimized settings. For optimized settings here, we're looking at ones that are similar to the ones that I made for both the Spider-Man games, as these games have nearly the exact same graphical options and a similar performance profile to those games. Except this time around, it is indeed a bit heavier on the GPU, so I have some new recommendations in light of that. For one, turn down hair to medium. It keeps the quality visibly the exact same in my experience as I described earlier, but it might potentially offer a performance advantage. I haven't found one yet, but it's better to be safe than sorry, and honestly, any potentially better GPU performance is better than none at all, especially when this game is asking a lot from your GPU. Same with particles. Scarcely a difference is visible there between medium and high, but it does offer an ever so minuscule advantage in performance. So I will now recommend medium for my optimized settings. I also recommend the LOD be set to medium instead of high to aid the GPU as much as possible, and it does have a smaller visual footprint like I talked about earlier. And lastly, turn down the shadows to medium, as you will see a minor increase in aliasing, but also a nice little bump up to performance. With regards to the new ray traced ambient occlusion setting, I do honestly like it, and it's cheap enough, as you can see here, if you're already using RT reflections like in this example. Just a small stepping stone there in performance when going from SSAO to medium medium or TAO. But I will still advise against it for my general recommended settings, which are meant for the mid to lower mid-end GPUs of yesteryear. But if you do have a slightly higher end GPU, give it a try to see what happens on medium or the high setting, which perform very similar. If you like it and are fine with the performance, then go for it. And with that, you have my new optimized settings for this game. It's a bit different from the Spider-Man games, but mostly the same. Like those games, I'm also going to recommend using ray trace reflections at the high setting if you can, since it meaningfully impacts the visuals. But bear in mind that ray tracing has a video memory performance cost. If you are using ray trace reflections like seen here on a GPU with low memory, like 8 gigabytes, very high textures as seen on the right can perform worse and lead to longer loading times as GPU memory is thrashed. This is the exact same recommendation I have for Spider-Man, and it applies here as well. When playing around with my optimized settings on an RTX 2070 Super, I noticed two important things that you and the audience need to consider. For one, 1440p with 60 FPS and dynamic resolution scaling with my optimized settings was inconsistent on the RTX 2070 Super and would require a VRR display for a good experience or a lower resolution on a fixed refresh rate display. There are a couple of reasons for this. For one, the game's dynamic resolution scaling is a bit gradual. It's not coarse and preserves the image quality more so than it does the frame rate, I would say. So that means you can drop frames due to the dynamic resolution not adjusting too quickly. Another thing is that a lot of the gameplay can be at 60, but there are scenes that are just too heavy on the GPU, like this one here, where it's below 60 FPS, even with DRS working its magic going to the lowest bound. There's just not enough juice to get 60 at 1440p reasonably with RT on and an RTX 2070 Super here. That was of course possible in Spider-Man Remastered with my optimized settings. And that goes to show you that this game is indeed heavier than the Spider-Man games at these similar settings. A second thing I noticed is in regards to VRAM usage. Now in my experience, the VRAM usage here is similar enough to the Spider-Man games, but it might require a little bit more. So if your PC is not tuned for performance, you may be in trouble. As an example of what I mean, it's not good to have a lot of programs open in the background on your PC that start up with Windows. Check this out. On the left, there's a recording of an RTX 2070 Super with my optimized settings at 1440p with a lot of programs running in the background. How many, you may ask? Well, this many in the taskbar with shortcuts. Yikes, that's a lot of programs running in the background. In the recording on the right, as we see here, I have closed those programs and prevented them from starting except for Steam. Now look how much better the performance is on the right versus the left. This is the exact same system here. It's just that the GPU is performing better because more of the dedicated GPU memory can be used for the game and not for random background programs. That's why we see a greater amount of GPU VRAM being used on the right, as you can see here, and it's also why we see less system memory being used, as we can see here, as on the left, more system memory is having to be used for textures, as that GPU memory is fuller due to those background programs. When a GPU uses system memory for textures, it can slow rendering down, and that's why we see the left side running a lot slower than the right. So definitely make sure your PC itself is optimized just as much as your settings in game are. With that being said, we need to talk about the necessity of an SSD for Ratchet and Clank on PC. Now, at this point in time, other outlets have already talked about this and looked at it, but I'll just reiterate it in this video. Yes, you can play the game on a hard drive like you're seeing here. This is the game running on an ultra high-end rig at the highest possible settings on a hard drive. It's totally playable in your average gameplay of just shooting and walking around. Just as playable as any super fast SSD. This is normal gameplay, which will make up like something like 80% of the game, but it's not doing any of the super duper streaming. For the other 20% of the gameplay and cutscenes, there is a lot of streaming that will occur. And this is where a normal 7200 RPM hard drive, or any hard drive for that matter, will showcase issues. Some are smaller, like you can see in the game's intro cutscene here, when it transitions to Ratchet, and there will be a stutter. Now let's look at how that plays out.
Don't you think it's weird to throw a celebration for us?
If you noticed, as that cutscene was playing, the audio was out of sync and it slowly started to get more in sync as the cutscene moved on. That's not the worst thing with that pause, but it's also not exactly the experience that is intended at all. In other mid-game streaming moments on a hard drive, you will see some added in performance hitches that wouldn't be there on an SSD, like when I finish grinding this rail, for example. But the biggest issues are in-game portals, which on the first run through will basically be awful to look at and experience.
Dimensions are weakening considerably.
Really, as you're watching this play out on screen right now, I would never describe this as enjoyable to look at or watch or play. Look at how often the game just stops moving, or how long it takes for each portal to transition. The game basically loses its core visual design and identity at this point when we're watching this, and I would say yes indeed, it is not really possible on an HDD at these settings. But technically, it could be possible on an HDD, and I can show you what I mean. Check this out. If I rerun that warp sequence without having restarted my PC, it basically runs flawlessly even on the hard drive. The reason for this is because nearly all the data has already been cached into system RAM via Windows at this point. So the data is now being moved into video memory perfectly with DirectStorage from system RAM. On a technical level, this means the game, if it were rewritten with a pre-buffering of sorts for more data into system memory before you get to those areas in the game where streaming occurs, and if you had a lot of system memory, then yes, you would be able to run this game quite well on a hard drive. But at that point, we're getting into academic arguments here. The PS5 doesn't have 32 gigs of system memory to play with like on PC. The original idea of this game only being possible on PS5's SSD was referencing that system's memory configuration and the PS4's memory layout. The PS4 would definitely not have the memory, CPU speed, or anything to make this at all possible. A high-spec PC with a version of this game that was coded differently to buffer more into system memory beforehand, well then yes. But that's not the version of the game we have here. So my answer here is that the game really in its current form is not great on a hard drive while looking good. Sure, if you turn down the graphics to their absolute lowest like we're seeing here, well yes, then the game does work in its absolute worst moment during the portal jump in the game's intro. There are less huge assets being streamed in on the fly here, so an HDD can actually keep up fine enough with minimal pausing. It's not at all the visual quality though of the PS5 version. But yes, it technically works. This is a sliding scale though. It works on this big PC, but as Rich showed in our preview video, it will become worse and less stable on a hard drive the lower the rest of that system is. If you have worse CPU and worse memory configuration and a worse hard drive, well then it becomes a complete mess, even on the lowest settings. Hopefully that answers the question of whether or not this game works on a hard drive for you in the audience. So what kind of storage does the game actually require to run well, aka a pretty good 60 FPS with little pausing? I would say for the best experience you want at least an NVMe Gen 3 drive when using higher settings that look more like the PlayStation 5 version of the game. A stock SATA SSD will run the game well enough in its worst moments during the portal sequence in that game's intro, but it will still add in pauses that you would not see there on a faster NVMe storage media. It's completely playable, I would say, but that level of pausing in the sequence is a bit distracting, though it is not a game breaker like playing it on an HDD. Obviously, at the lower the settings, a stock SATA SSD will be perfectly fine during that worst case scenario, as the bandwidth requirement will be lower. Once again, this is a sliding scale. You need more bandwidth from storage the higher the settings are. Now, how much bandwidth, you might ask? Well, when doing the opening at the highest settings possible, I saw a normal usage of around 500 megabytes per second on a 7.1 gigabyte per second NVMe. Now, I've read online that it can reportedly go higher to around 1.2 gigabytes per second, according to other people taking measurements, so I would say at least have an NVMe drive in excess of that level of bandwidth for a good experience here with the least pausing potential. This brings us to the question of how loading is actually done on PC and what is exactly going on. This is a DirectStorage title, so what's happening behind the scenes here? In my discussion with Nixies, I know that the game uses GPU decompression with G-Deflate for nearly all the higher res assets in the game, so big textures and whatnot. Smaller assets like low resolution textures or lower res texture MIPS use CPU decompression with the LZ4 format. With this, there are two sources decompressing assets on the GPU to hopefully not overburden either one of them. In practice, I've noticed some curious characteristics of this loading system on PC, and specifically when I use the benchmark of that warp sequence. For one, I don't think any PC out there can actually match the PS5's speed in doing that portal sequence, as in when it starts and when it ends. On average, the PS5, in comparison to a high-spec PC like we're seeing here, will complete the sequence around 1 second or more faster. This is, of course, a really beefy PC with 32 gigs of RAM, 7.1 gigabytes per second SSD, and an RTX 4090 on a Core i9-12900K. That's tons more bandwidth and processing power. Yet it is slower, so this made me want to investigate where current bottlenecks might be in this sequence. First, I reduced the amount of cores and threads the game has available to it, and here I found that reducing cores and threads does not meaningfully negatively affect the speed of loading. In fact, in single one-off tests that I measured, the lower core count actually could complete lower than the standard test I did with full cores. Those 6 and 8P core runs that I did have lower average frame rates, of course, but they didn't affect the loading speed. What about system memory? Well, this actually does affect it. We can see loading time going up by about 1.3 seconds when RAM speed is almost halved. There's a clear linear relationship there, but it's honestly nothing dramatic. So RAM speed doesn't seem super important. Finally, I did single core speed, and here's where we see the largest relationship with loading speed. Reducing the clock of the 12900K in 1 GHz increments showed the most dramatic difference. So it seems like loading speed of this sequence is most correlated with single thread processor speed, so it is somehow more single thread limited. I also measured other factors like GPU type and PCIe bandwidth, but they didn't really affect anything and just showed normal variance. Lastly, I looked into the speed of storage media, and here I found that halving the speed of an NVMe drive doesn't actually dramatically affect the loading time of this sequence, just like I showed off in our preview video. So at the moment, the game's loading does seem limited by something, but it's hard to know exactly what it is. Could be pre-programmed pausing for an animation's sake, or maybe it is single thread limited on PC. But that is where things stand, and I hope it does kind of change in the future and get a little bit faster. Given that, my conclusion regarding this PC version at launch is that it is quality in the way a Nixie's port is. I think the menu is great, and I do think they treat the PC versions with a special reverence that is easy as day to see in many aspects of it. But I also think it is coming in with far too many low-hanging fruit issues and oversights, not all of which I've cataloged in this video. In fact, in the process of making this video, they've already fixed a couple of the ones that I mentioned at the beginning of it, like anisotropic filtering. Now, I imagine even more issues will be fixed over time, and in the meantime, I recommend you hold off playing the game unless you really lack patience. In a month's time, you will have a much more polished game to play, and that is how I will want to play it if I do, and how I wished it would have launched. And with that being said, that is enough for me for now. So if you did like this video, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. If you're already a subscriber, hit that little bell in the corner to be informed as soon as DF posts a video. Other than that, support us on Patreon, follow on Twitter, and as always, this is Alex bidding you farewell und auf Wiedersehen.
It worked! I am the winner!